which is just, it's new. It's relatively new. You guys might notice down here that I've got a C plugged on this photo. So Dipsastria is within the last few years new to what we call these sort of donut-like corals in the Indo-Pacific, okay? We used to call them Favia, and we also used to think that like a lot of these sort of circular, corallided, you know, looks like little donut-like corals were Favia in the Indo-Pacific, but we were wrong, okay? It's sort of been reclassified. Now it only exists in the Caribbean. This is a Favia fragum. This is not my photo, it's just source down the bottom there. They are found in the Caribbean, and it's been also realized that they are not actually at all related to the corals in the Indo-Pacific, even though their morphology is very similar. I mean, as you guys can see in these photos right here, I mean, they do have some quite clear characteristics that look quite like each other. So I used to love saying Favia was my favorite donut, and that was how I remembered it because it was a donut shaped coral. You can absolutely do that if you're in the Caribbean if you want to, but in the Indo-Pacific, please do remember that this is now called Dipsastria. They grow as massive and submassive. They are usually quite nice circular donut shapes, but they have got this intratentacular budding. So occasionally you'll see these sort of figure 8 shapes when they're pinching off to become more polyps, or when they're growing more polyps, I should say. Okay, in this photo in particular, you can see the obvious septa to costae area. It has not got a smooth synastrum. You can see that the costae run all the way down until they meet with those from the bordering corallites there. And additionally, the corallites, being the whole, you know, skeletal part of where the polyp sits, protrude out slightly, as you can see here. So also, I forgot, we're in the Merulinidae now, which is another family name. Great. So then we've got Montastria. This is not in the Indo-Pacific. I just wanted to mention it because we used to, again, say that it was a coral in the Pacific. It's not, it's actually monospecific. It is Montastria cavanosa. It is one of the more commonly referred to corals of the Caribbean waters. So again, I wanted to include it, even though this is a predominantly Indo-Pacific based lecture, that this is just one of those general species of note, you know, of significance, if you guys did want to remember this. Also quite donut shaped. I think it looks somewhere between our Dipsastria and our Diploastria, Hydephora, which was the first monospecific coral that we talked about in this lecture. This has also got extra tentacular budding, which makes it different to the Favia fragum that is also found in the Caribbean, that also has very circular sort of corallites there. All right, and then we've got Akinopora, also part of the Merulinidae, which has got irregular corallites, synastrum covered in fine spinules. So we've got spinules, we've got spicules, we've got monticules. Again, all just names describe bumpy skeleton. If you want, you can just say the skeleton is bumpy. That's totally fine. Akinopora is the thing that we're aiming to remember today. They grow as encrusting, laminar, and submassive, okay? These ones can be a little bit confused for Astropora, because if you remember from the very beginning, from the Acroporidae family, Acropora have also got that sort of scattered, you know, irregular corallites, googly eyes scattered on the floor kind of look to it. But Astropora has a very dug out appearance in the center, whereas these guys do not. They've just got these nice bumps. I also think these are a little bit echidna-like. Akinopora is the other echidna coral. These little mounds that just tuck themselves in and they put out their bumpy, spiky back so that nothing is going to hurt them, okay? At least that's what echidnas do when they feel like they're being threatened. But again, irregular corallites, space in the middle, and that space is bumpy. Sweet. So I just want to pre-warn you guys that the next few genera are a little bit tricky, but it's going to be okay. We're going to get through it together. Don't feel like you're going to have to remember all these on the first go, because no one ever does, except for some people. And let's be honest, I don't like those people because this took me forever. but we'll just jump straight into it. So Varieties got 20 species. It has irregularly shaped corallites. Some of them look like little squares, some of them are triangles, some of them are ovals. So remember, Varieties has got irregular corallites. We've got shared walls. They're not separate between corallite to corallite, like in these guys here. That's its own wall, that's its own wall. Whereas in this one, it's just the walls are shared between all of them. The corallites are also very angular. From the top of the wall to where the mouth sits, it's on this nice fine angle. Okay, so that's another way to remember it. It's got medium sort of clean cut septal teeth as well. They're quite neat and they grow as massive, submassive and encrusting. Sometimes we get these cool color differences between the walls and sort of the base of the polyps. This is not that much, but you sometimes get like greens in the middle and yellow on the wall. And for me, I always thought, wow, that's so pretty. Varieties is my favorite. And again, Varieties, favorite, similar words, even though nowadays I've got about 100 favorite corals. Anyhow. Now we're going to talk about Gonistria, 9 species, and it's got an excavated appearance, okay, quite dug out in appearance, like you can see in this Gonistria minata. It can weakly meander, so it nearly looks like it's trying to fully meander and become, like not puzzle, like a maze, but it's sort of not quite getting there, as we can see in these photos of down here, okay? It's got irregular shaped corallites, like our Varieties, but they're much more dug out than our Varieties. This is probably the nicer example down here. The corallites got neat septa, and what I want you guys to remember is that they've got paliform lobes. So if you remember from the beginning, skeletal structure, I said paliform lobes. A lot of corals don't have them, but when they do, they're quite useful to remember that they do have, because they're often the distinguishing factor. And this is going to be a distinguishing factor for us. So it's kind of like the secondary wall or crown just before you get to the mouth of the corallite. As you guys can sort of see here, you got the wall, it dips down, and then there's like this sort of secondary wall, and then you've got the mouth down there in the middle, in the bottom, okay? You can sort of see them along here as well. So paliform lobes are going along with Gonistria. Gonistria sounds like gonads. When we do coral spawning work, we would often work with Gonistria a lot because they're quite a resilient species. So it would be sort of on our priorities list, and we'd play with their gonads. No, well, sure. Say that if it's going to help you at all, you should just think of it like that, sure. These guys grow as massive, submassive, and branching as well in very specific examples. Deep breath. And then we've got Paragoniastria. So I've got Garoniastria, and then we've got Paragoniastria. So and one that I really quite like is called Paragoniastria australensis. It used to be chucked in with the Goniastria genus, and then scientists were like, no, that's wrong. Actually, it's got to go in their own genus called Paragoniastria. And so they did that. There are 3 species, and here's an example of all of them. One is full on meandering, baby, and look at that. It's like a crazy maze that is just inescapable. And then we've got some that are just sort of your typical, more circular, round corallites, as you can see here. Racelli, Deformis, and Australensis. That's my favorite one. They grow as submassive and encrusting. They are meandroid or steroid. They've got quite uniform septa, especially the Australensis. Look at those. Look how neat they are. I love it. They've also got paliform lobes present, but I think they're more present in the Deformis and the Racelli, just personally speaking, from me looking for them, amongst corals and so on and forth. They're quite obvious, especially like where I'm putting my cursor right now. There, it's like, boom, here's my mouth crown, here's my paliform lobe. And there we go. Also, the walls and valley floors can contrast in color, just like in literally all of these photos. You got like brownish to the green. You got the kind of blue to the blue-green to the white. We've got the green to the pink. So they're aesthetic, at least, even though they're a tricky genus. And then we've got Platygyra. I know this looks a bit different. This looks a bit similar to Paragoniastria australensis, which is over here, but it's okay. On the tops of the walls, Platygyra are a bit more like this. So you got your valleys and you've got walls and they're quite flat at the surface. On the Paragoniastria, they kind of like turn into this nice, like sort of like rounded bit. I'm going to go back for a moment. As you can see here, kind of like a nice point. Platygyra is not quite like that. They've also got shared walls, of course. They are fully meandroid. Valleys and ridges also can have the contrasting colours. And sure, they can be confused a little bit with the Gonistria and the Paragoniastria, but these guys definitely no paliform lobe, like there isn't even a hint of them. In some of the Paragoniastria australensis, you're looking down the valley and you're thinking, oh, it sort of is, sort of isn't, I'm sort of not sure. Whereas these guys, you look inside of it and it is incredibly flat, okay, in those valleys. So honestly, I know it's still a little bit tricky and time it gets better, but that's sort of like the characteristic that I go for every time. Okay, we can discuss later if you guys want to, but we'll move on to Hydephora. We are sort of leaning towards the later end of the corals that we're discussing today. So I hope none of you guys are, you know, hating me too much at this point in time. But I just wanted to tell you guys as much as we could and make the most of this. So Hydephora is still part of the Merulinidae family. Hydephora, if you guys remember from the colony formation slide, like at the very beginning, there was this colony formation called Hydephoroid. That's for this one. Other corals don't do it. This one does. And they were like, we got to think of another way to describe this skeletal bump. So they came up with the word Hydephores. Okay. So polyps of this coral are nested in between these Hydephores, and they've got these beautiful daytime extended tentacles, okay? I honestly, guys, to ID this, wouldn't bother even looking for the polyps. All you've got to look for are these large bumps, these Hydephores, and you're good to go. They can often look a little bit fuzzy, like in this colony on the bottom left-hand side. And I always just, you know, remember the word association by saying Hydephore has got its polyps hidden amongst the Hydephores. It's because like I usually can't see them because they're covering the tentacles or the Hydephores are in the way and they're dense anyways. But this is a very, very, very nice, beautiful colony for sure. Actually probably not as common and frequent as the other ones we've been talking about today, but I feel like its beauty level was worth throwing it into the lecture. So if you guys have seen it in real life as well, I hope that you guys can appreciate that one there. So then we've got Marilina, which I think is the last of the Merulinidae for this family. It's a little bit, it's not confusing, but it's not in one way or any other really distinctive. So what we can remember, well, firstly, the growth forms are encrusting, laminar, folio, since they're massive, but it has got rather indistinct correlates. There's one here, here's another one, there's a couple like that. And they're in quite short valleys, which you can probably see demonstrated a bit more in this photo down here, that fan towards the colony margin. So they're always heading outwards, as we can see here, as we can see along here, and as we can see just all around the entire edge. It's never going to be running, those valleys are never running parallel to the edge of the edge of the coral. They're always running towards it. And for me, if you look at the tops at least, kind of looks like uneven zippers, okay? You don't get a contrast in between the valleys and the valley floor like we do in some of those other corals in the Merulinidae family that we were just looking at.